Outside on the landing, he told Gran that he was obligated to make a report, but that he would ask the police commissioner to not start his inquiry for a couple of days. He shouldn't be left alone tonight. Does he have any family? None that I know of, but I can stay with him myself. He shook his head. Mind you, he's another that I can't rely to say I know, but we must help one another. Automatically, Ryu looked at the dark corner of the corridor and asked Gran if the rats had entirely vanished from the area. The civil servant had no idea. Certainly people had spoken a good deal about the business, but he paid very little attention to the rumors in the neighborhood. I had other concerns, he said. Ryu was already shaking his head. He was just in a hurry to see the concierge before writing to his wife. The vendors of the evening papers were shouting that the invasion of rats had ended, but Ryu found his patient laying half out of his bed, one hand on his belly and the other hand around his neck, convulsively vomiting in the reddish bile of the rubbish bin. After long efforts, the concierge laid back in bed, gasping for breath. His temperature was 38.5, and the lymph nodes of his neck and limbs were swollen to 2 blackish patches that were spreading on his side. He was now compiling the internal pains. It's burning, he said. The swine is burning me. His clogged throat made him stumble over his words, and his head was aching so much that the tears of his bulging eyes that he turned towards the doctor. His wife looked anxiously at Ryu, who said nothing. Doctor, she asked, what is it? It could be anything. So far, we can't be sure. Until this evening, diet and pulverize, he must drink a lot. Indeed, the concierge was consuming his thirst. Once he'd got home, Ryu telephoned the control. Dr. Richard, who was now the leading doctor in the town. No, Richard said, I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary. Not high temperatures with local inflammation. Well, yes, as it happens, 2 cases of very enlarged lymph nodes. Abnormally so? Huh, said Richard. You know what's normal? That evening, the concierge had deliriums, and his temperature was now 40 degrees, and was complaining about the rats. Ryu tried to fixation the absence, and the turbine burning him. The concierge screamed, oh, that swine, the lymph nodes had swollen even more, and they were hard to the wooden touch. His wife was in a terrible state. Keep an eye on him, said the doctor, and call me if you need anything. The following day, April 30th, an already warm breeze was blowing beneath the damp blue skies and brought a scent of flowers from the most distant suburbs. The sound of the mornings in the streets seemed livelier and merrier than usual. Throughout the little town, freed from the dull sense of foreboding which they had endured for weeks, this was the day of rebirth. Even Ryu, reassured by the letter of his wife, went down to see the concierge in a light-heated mood. And that morning, indeed, the man's temperature had fallen to 38 degrees. Through the week, and the patient was smiling in his bed. I'm improving, doctor, isn't he? Said his wife, a bit too soon to say. But by noon, the patient's temperature had suddenly rose to 40 degrees. He was constantly delirious and vomiting again. His lymph nodes in his neck were painful to the touch, and the concierge seemed to want to keep his head as far as possible away from his body. His wife was sitting at the end of the bed with her hands on the blanket, gently holding on to the sick man's feet. She looked at Ryu. Listen, he said, we have to isolate him and try some emergency treatments. I'll phone the hospital and we'll get him there by ambulance. 2 hours later, in the ambulance, the doctor and his wife were leaning over the patient, broken words emerging from his mouth, and it were covered in a fungal growth. The rats, he said, greenish with waxy lips, lined eyes, and short, panting breasts, turmoiled by his lymph nodes, and pressing against his back on the stretcher of the bed, as though he'd worn the cloth it around him, and that as if something rising from the depths of the earth were constantly calling him. The concierge with swifting breath, more invisible weight. His wife wept. Is there no hope then, doctor? He is dead, Rayu said. You might say that the death of the concierge marked the end of this period full of troubling signs, and the start of another, completely and more difficult, in which the original sense of surprise gradually gave way to panic. Our fellow citizens, as they now realized, had never thought our little town might be the place particularly chosen for as one where rats die in the sun. Concierge perished in particular illnesses. From that point of view, indeed, they were the markings discovered that they had to adjust to ideas. If it had all stopped there, old habits no doubt would have resigned to the upper hand. But others of our fellow citizens who were not the concierge or poor people were to follow M. Michael down the same path. This is where fear began, and with it serious reflection. However, before describing the new events in detail, the narrator feels it would be helpful to give a view of another witness, the period who had been described. Jean Trelou, whom we have already met at the start of the account, was settled in Oran a few weeks earlier, and since been living in a large hotel in the center. Apparently, he was well off to be living in a private income. Even though the town had gradually become accustomed to him, no one could tell where he came from and why he was there. People ran into him at the public places in town. Since the start of spring, he had been seen a lot at the beach, often swimming with oblivious pleasure. Pleasant and always smiling, he seemed to enjoy all normal pleasures without being enslaved to them. As a matter of fact, the only habit he was known to have was his regularly spent time in the Spanish dancers and musicians, for whom he had quite a few in the town. In any case, his notebook was continued in a short and chronicle of the difficult period through which the particular type of chronicle, in that it seems to adopt a deliberate policy of insignificance. At first, you might think that Trelou had gone out of his way to view people and things as large ends of a telescope. In short, in the midst of his general confusion, he determined to become a historian of that which has no history. Of course, one may deplore the bias in the subject of the deserves from some dryness of the heart, but the fact remains that as the chronicle of time, the notebook can give us a mass or minor details which are none the less important. Indeed, they're very orderly, will prevent us from becoming too hasty and passing judgment on an interesting character. The first note that Jean Trelou made the date he arrived in Orient. From the very start, he exhibited curious satisfaction at finding himself in a town that was so interestingly ugly. Here we find a detailed description of the 2 bronze lions at the Hotel de Ville, the charitable reflection of the absence of trees in the unprepossessing house, of the ridiculous layout of the town. Trelou also overheard in tram of the streets, and no comment except a little later, in the case of one such exaggerated about a certain campus. Trelou heard 2 tram conductors talking. You knew campus, didn't you? Said one of them. Campus? The tall fellow with the black mustache. That's the one. He was on point. Yes, of course I did. Well, he's dead. Oh. What was it then? After the business with the rats. Well. What wronged him? I don't know. A temperature, and then he wasn't strong, and an absence under his arms, and couldn't fight it off. Even so, he seemed like anyone else. No, he had a weak chest, and played music for the choir. It wears you out, always blowing down a tube. Ah, well, said the second man. When you're ill, you shouldn't blow down a tube. After the brief dialogue, Lou wondered why Campus had joined the choir when he was so obvious not to be his interest, and what were the fundamental reasons that drove him to risk his life to take part in the Sunday marches. Next, Lou seemed to have been favorably impressed by a scene he was often out on the balcony opposite window. His room looked over a small side street where cats would sleep in the shade of the walls. But every day after lunch, at a time when the whole town was drowsing in heat, a little old man would appear on the balcony on the other side of the street. With well-combined white hair, stern and upright clothes of a military cut, he would call to the cats with a puss-puss, and was the only soft and distant. Pale with sleep, the cats raised their eyes without the first bothering to move. The men would then tear little pieces of paper above the street, and the creatures would attract by the shower of white butterflies come out into the middle of the road, raising inquiring paws towards the little last pieces of paper. At this, the little old man would spit at the cats firmly and accurately, and when one of his gobs of saliva hit the target, he would laugh. Finally, Treyu seemed to have been entirely taken with the commensurate character of the town, whose appearance, life, and even pleasure seemed to be a distract by the consideration of trade. This particular, that is the term he used in his notebook, was what the Treyu approved of. One of his passages praising the event ended with the exclamation, "At last, there's the only place where a traveler's notes in a period seem to have something personal about him." However, it is hard to access the meaning of seriousness of such remark. So, after the description of how discovery of the dead rats had caused the cashier at a hotel to make the mistake in his bill, Treyu added in his writing, and it was less clear and unusual. Question: how can one manage not to lose time? Answer: experience it through a full length. Means spend days in a dentist waiting room on an uncomfortable chair, living on one's balcony on the Sunday afternoon, listening to lectures in a language that one does not understand, chosen the most roundabout and least convenient routes to the railway, and naturally traveling, starting up and queer in a box office that threatens, and so on, and take one seat, etc. But immediately after those extravagant language or thoughts, the notebook launches into a detailed description of the trams of our town. Their gondola shape, with the indeterminate color, and their customary dirty appearance, ended with the observations with such expressions, it's remarkable, with which explains nothing. Is there any event here as what Treyu had said about the business of the rats? Today, the little old man opposite is very put out. There are no more cats. They had vanished instantly by the dead rats, and they've been found in great numbers in the streets. In my opinion, it's no matter for the cats eating the dead rats. I remember the mine hated them. Even so, they must be running around the cells, and the little old man is very put out. His hair is untidy, and he seems less hale and hearty. You can see he is worried. After a while, he went back inside and did his bit. Once in thin air, in town, the tram had stopped today because they found dead rats on it. Now no one where they came from. 2 or 3 women got off, and the rats had thrown out. The tram drove away. In the hotel, the night porter, who reliable sort told me that they had expecting something bad to come with all those rats. When the rats leave the ship, he replied that the tune of the case ships, that they had never been proven bad where the town's concerned. But he remained convinced. I asked him what misfortune he thought we should expect. He didn't know, since misfortune was impossible to predict. Though he wouldn't be surprised if an earthquake would fit the bill. I agree it is possible. He asked me if I were worried or not. The only thing that I'm interested in, I said, is the inner peace. He understood that perfectly. There's a rather interesting family in the hotel restaurant. The father is tall and thin man, dressed in black and a stiff collar. The crown of his head is bald, and he has 2 turf gray hairs on either side, and his hard little round eyes, his slender nose, and his straight mouth makes him look like a well-trained owl. He is always the first to arrive at the door of the restaurant and stands back so his wife can pass. She is as tiny as a black mouse and walks on with a little boy and little girl at her heels, dressed like performing dogs. Once the man reaches his table, he waits for his wife to sit down, then does himself, before the 2 poodles are allowed to perch in their chairs. He addresses his wife and children using a formal yours and delivers himself with politely cutting remarks to the first and summary orders of his heirs. Nicole, you are behaving with a subliminally unpleasant manner. The little girl was about to burst into tears. That is what he wants. This morning the boy was very excited by the business of the rats. He wanted to say something, but during the meal. We don't talk about rats at the table, Philip. From now on, I forbid you to mention the word. Your father's right, said the black mouse. The 2 poodles stuck their noses into their bowls, and the owl thick with a nod and gave a little away. Despite a good example, people around the town are talking a great deal about the business of the rats. The newspapers have taken it up, and the large local news page, usually very diverse, is now entirely occupied by the campaign against the town authorities. Are our town dignitaries aware of the danger that may arise from the rotting corpses of the rodents? The manager of the hotel cannot talk of anything else, but this is partly because his anger about it. He seems unimaginable that the rats, should be discovered in the lift in the respectable hotel. To control himself, I said, but everything has to be the same thing. Exactly, he replied. Now we are like everybody else.